Time magazine, and I'm your moderator. And usually, of course, the moderator is supposed to be very neutral about the subject, but after the travel misadventures I had last night trying to get here, which included the bomb threat in LaGuardia and like a sprint through the high altitude down the United Terminal in Denver to make my connection to Aspen, I'm feeling very well disposed to anything local at all. That includes conferences as well. So, but nonetheless, we'll keep an open mind. I usually cover environmental issues for Time, and that more often than not means climate change. And that can be kind of a tough sledding with readers. I mean, to try to explain or try to get them excited about the ins and outs of cap and trade or carbon trading is pretty tough. But food doesn't have that problem. Everyone seems to have everyone seems to have an opinion about food, what we should eat, how we should make it, and increasingly now where it should come from. And that's after years of taking advantage of an industrial food system that would ship New Zealand apples to Washington State, that would really eliminate the idea of seasonality to a large degree. I think over the last few years we've been thinking a lot about the footprint that our food has. And that's changed the way we think about our meals as well. You see farmers markets that go from quaint weekend visits to necessities for many urbanites who themselves would never set foot in a farm. You see terms like community-sponsored agriculture, which of course is when a group of people will pay for the share of a harvest in a farm or support in that way. Enters into our vocabulary, and we begin to think of food not just in terms of taste, but in terms of miles as well. I think some of that comes from concerns over the impact that agriculture is having on global warming. According to a report from a few years back from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, our global food system as a whole supposedly contributes more to climate change than all the cars, trucks, and planes in the world. So the answer here is the answer here to get small and to get local, to source as much of food as possible from farmers within 50, 100, 150 mile radius? And really, is that even possible? And if we do that, though, will we enjoy food that's easier on the earth, but also better tasting, more nutritious? Will it even perhaps revitalize a rural sector that has fallen in disrepair in the United States? I mean, actually bring back farmers into the United States. So we're going to look at whether that's possible and also whether it's really even a good idea. And we've got a great panel here for you. Starting to my right here is Jennifer Wilkins. She teaches at Cornell's College of Human Ecology, and her work focuses on how our food and agricultural systems impact human health, the environment, and the rural community. And you also direct the Farm to School program as well for Cornell? Right, and that helps connect these two institutions that have gotten pretty separate in America these days. All the way to the left here is Dan Glickman. He's president of the Motion Picture Association of America, which means he should be on a panel that's a lot more glamorous than this one, probably. But food is very glamorous too. But before he lighted out for Hollywood, though, he did serve as Secretary of Agriculture during the Clinton administration. And he was in the House of Representatives for, I believe, 18 years before that, and with a lot of focus on agriculture and food issues. So he has a great perspective to bring. To my immediate left is Mardell Burkholder, who is the executive director of the Children's Health Foundation, which is based right here in Aspen, so she'll put to test the idea that being local is better. CHF advances policies that will benefit children's health, and lately has been focusing on nutrition as a way to combat childhood obesity. And if you saw a panel early in the morning, she went into great detail about that and the work that they're doing on that. And lastly, all the way on the right, we have Bjorn Lomborg, who is the import. He's definitely the least local member of our panel. He is an adjunct professor at the Copenhagen Business School and the director of the Copenhagen Consensus. And he's well known as the Skeptical Environmentalist, which is the title of his 1998 book, which basically could be subtitles, Everything You Know About Environmentalism is Completely Wrong. He lives in Denmark, but when he's not traveling the world and tearing the arguments of the green mainstream into little bitty pieces. So I'm going to start with Jennifer. We hear a lot about the benefits of eating locally in terms of it being better tasting, in terms of it being better for local communities. But beyond that sense of moral righteousness we might get when we do things like that, what is the scientific evidence that food that is locally sourced actually is better for us? Is it out there? I mean, is it more nutritious?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for giving it to me ahead of time. This is a question that I work at Cornell University, and I work in the extension part of the university. So this is a question I've been getting quite a lot over the last few years from our extension educators at the county level and from the general public as well. local is great, but is it more nutritious? Because I think one of the motivations for them asking me this question is they want to say that it's more nutritious. So they want to be able to say, here's another reason to eat locally. So it's a question that is very frequent. I don't know if it's the most important question, especially if it's interpreted to be a comparison of, say, for example, a apple that is grown and harvested in a nearby orchard versus one that might be transported 3,000 miles away. But nonetheless, when you start exploring how you would answer the question, you get into some pretty interesting territory. If you interpret the question as just comparing like products, either distant or close by, that's one of the things I'm going to talk about. But then there are other ways of interpreting the question and other kinds of evidence that we can use when answering the question, is eating locally more nutritious or not, which is a slightly different question. So what can we say about this question, comparing fruits and vegetables? And I'm going to stick with that consideration of fruits and vegetables, because I think when people are asking, is local more nutritious, they're usually talking about fruits and vegetables, and they're not talking about milk or meat or grains. They're usually talking about produce. So by the time fruits and vegetables reach your kitchen counter, whether it's from a stall at a farmer's market or from a supermarket, several factors are involved in determining the nutritional quality. The vitamin and mineral content of fruits and vegetables depends on decisions that are made from farm to table, from seed to table, whether or not the system is local or global. So the factors that I'm going to talk about come to play in whether fruits and vegetables come from a very local source or whether they're coming from a distant source. And as you may know, the average distance that fruits and vegetables travel is about 1,500 miles. So let's talk about the factors that come into play then. First of all, variety. The variety, the kinds of seeds, the variety that farmers choose to plant of any given fruit and vegetables is one of the factors that determines nutritional quality. Most fruits and vegetables found in supermarkets, and this is where you might, so the overall question here is, are these factors favoring nutrition in a more localized system or in a more distant system? The supermarket varieties that you find are usually a narrower set of varieties that you would find in most farmers markets, for example. The varieties that are chosen by farmers that are likely to market through a mass distribution channel are going to be varieties that are chosen for their growth rate. So they want crops that grow faster. They want these varieties to withstand long-distance shipping without diminishing quality. And they want varieties that yield a lot. So they want a lot of yield per acre. Unfortunately, these traits, which benefit national and international produce distribution, often come at the expense of nutrition. And the fruits and vegetables varieties differ in appearance, taste, as well as vitamin and mineral and phytochemical content. Farmers, on the other hand, who are in the practice of marketing locally, marketing directly to consumers, are more likely to choose varieties that are unusual, that are very tasty, that are highly nutritious, and they're not as concerned as choosing varieties that withstand long-distance shipping because they don't need to do that. They're also more likely to choose many more different kinds of varieties than you'll find in a supermarket. So there's one factor that comes into play when you're trying to answer this question, is local more nutritious? Another factor is production method. And production methods that improve the health of the soil, such as the use of cover crops and composted manure as fertilizers, tend to yield crops with higher nutrient content. And there's some speculation as to why this is. Soils that have more biological activity in them, they are less compact, tend to have plants with a deeper root system and more complex root system that enables the plant to uptake nutrients more readily. Also, the kinds of fertilizer that are used in, say, an organic or an integrated pest management system release the nutrients into the soil at a slower rate than synthetic fertilizers do. So you have a slower and more gradual uptake of the plants. So despite, and so this is really combining the local question with maybe the organic question. And despite the shift in consumer demand from organic to local that is implied on that March 12, 2007 cover of Time magazine, research tells us that local and organic are not separated. They're not distinct categories in the minds of consumers. And in fact, when you explore what organic means to consumers, oftentimes local is part of their conceptualization of that definition. And likewise, when people are seeking local, oftentimes what they're after is environmentally sound production practices as well. So production method is another factor. Ripeness is another factor. And when produce is ready for harvest varies from one fruit and vegetable to another. And it depends on whether the produce is what's called climacteric or not. And climacteric fruits such as apples, nectarines, melons, apricots, peaches, and tomatoes can generate a ripening hormone called ethylene. And this is released after the plant has been, or the crop has been picked. Non-climacteric crops, for example, peppers and citrus fruits, reach their commercial maturity, so the point at which they will be acceptable for market, on the plant only. So some crops you can pick before they're ripe and they will ripen on their own, tomatoes being a very good example of this. They will reach their mature color, they will reach their mature form after they've been picked green. And this has a great impact on commercialization of the crop, because if you want to pick tomatoes and ship them long distances, you can do that, and by the time it arrives, it won't be past its peak ripeness, and therefore poorer quality. It will be at its peak ripeness. But there is a catch to this, and that is that for some crops, and tomatoes being a prime example, their certain nutrient content will not reach its peak unless it is allowed to ripen on the plant. And it is particularly important to consider that in terms of tomatoes, because tomatoes being the number one, or depending on the region in the country, number two most frequently consumed vegetable, that nutrient content then can have significance in terms of vitamin C in particular intake. So that would err on the side of choosing more locally grown vine-ripened tomatoes and processing them in a nearby location if that is available. How much more time do I have?
2, 3 more.
Okay. Other factors include post-harvest handling. Maintaining nutritional quality after fruits and vegetables are harvested requires careful handling, and this will then apply to whether a fruit or vegetable is grown and harvested 3,000 miles away, or one that's grown 15 miles down the road. This means chilling, getting that field heat out of the crop immediately, preventing bruising. Any kind of injury to a fruit or vegetable can increase the likelihood of nutrient loss. Maintaining proper humidity and storage temperature is really important for maintaining nutrient content. So that's post-harvest handling is another very important factor. Another is processing and packaging, and one of the things that's really become much more frequent in terms of vegetables is this slight, modest processing that goes on. The shredded lettuce or cut ready salads in the bag. Anytime you cut something or sliced anything, anytime you cut or slice a vegetable, you're increasing the exposure to air. You're increasing the rate at which nutrients are lost. Now, this can happen with a local product or one that's grown many miles away. But when we think about purchasing locally grown fruits and vegetables, generally we're not talking about those ready-to-eat salads. We're talking about purchasing whole fruits and vegetables. Storage is another factor, and this is where when you think about the long-distance shipping of fruits and vegetables and that cold chain that is maintained so accurately and to a standard, this is where long-distance shipping might actually have the edge in terms of a standard quality of handling. Because you're moving massive amounts of product, and that cold chain is maintained very well. If everything in the system goes well, you're likely to have much more variation in how produce is handled, because it's many, many different farms, many, many small operations, and many different kinds of trucks that might be bringing produce to, for example, a farmer's market. You're not going to have that standard transportation in a more local system. But it's very important to maintain that good storage, temperature, and humidity along the way. But then you've got transportation, of course, which is in my list, the last factor. And depending on if everything else is kept is equal. If all the handling practices are followed, exactly the same quality for the local versus the long-distance shipping, you still cannot reduce the 7 days of transportation across the country from harvesting to when it's marketed, for example, where I live in upstate New York. In contrast, a local farmer can bring a product after being harvested in the morning to market it within 4 hours or within a day. So you can't really get around that. So all things being equal, I think the local has the edge. It definitely has the edge when you consider the diversity of varieties that you're likely to get in a local system. And there are fewer people that will be likely handling produce in a local system. You generally have the farmer, his or her staff that will be bringing the produce to the market. But in a long-distance shipping, you have many more opportunities for handling to be done poorly or to be done well along the chain from a distant source to market. There's several other considerations when you're looking at nutrition and local versus distant shipping, but I think my time for now is up.
Thanks, Jennifer. We'll return to that after everyone's had a chance to speak, to make sure they all have time, and I'll ask a few questions and then open up to the floor. So next I want to go to Dan. As from your time as Secretary of Agriculture, obviously you know that our food system is extremely industrialized, very concentrated increasingly. Local and organic food, while it gets a lot of attention, is still a tiny percentage of that food system. Is it realistic to see a shift towards more local producers, not just on a niche basis, but larger? And how would that change our system?
I think the movement towards more farmers markets. We have 5,000 today. We had 2,000 12 years ago. Community gardening, urban gardening, direct marketing of farm products. That's very healthy for a lot of reasons. There's probably a nutritional advantage. And it's a good educational advantage because people will see food grown rather than they won't think that bread comes from the grocery store, that it actually comes from wheat or this. But the practical matter is we have a national goal of feeding over 300 million people every day, and people want full 12-month access to food at reasonable prices. So they can't get clementine oranges in upstate New York during most of the year, and they can't get locally grown blueberries most of the year. And so, and they also want this done safely, and they want it nutritious, but they want it and affordable. And we have very cheap food prices in this country compared to other places in the world, by the way. So, given that, it's hard to see what I call a radical change from the current system. But I think there are some trends. Like I said, the farmers market movement, urban gardening, more buying local, is healthy for a lot of reasons, and it gives people the experience of what it's like to grow food and the importance of it. I think it's worth looking at this issue of industrialization of agriculture. We didn't have industrialized agriculture until basically the 30s. And it was really after the Second World War. We had national security issues. We decided we wanted a food supply that was secure, that we could rely on to produce enough food to feed everybody in the country. And it was kind of trending with full industrialization in other aspects, automobiles, airplanes, you name it, and it's certainly been true in agriculture as well. Our farm programs have encouraged this, and because we've tended to support and subsidize crops, and only certain crops, but subsidize them based on your size. So the bigger you were, the more you got. And so that certainly didn't encourage local agriculture. We never subsidized fruits and vegetables. Virtually all subsidized crops are in 5 categories: wheat, corn, cotton, rice, soybeans. That gets 90% of the subsidy from our government. And ironically, the fruits and vegetable farmers did not want subsidies for the most part, because they had their own little tool. It was called marketing orders. And so they said, no, you stay out of the subsidy business. Now, this wasn't everybody. This is largely California and Florida and some of the larger markets. They said, but we want to protect ourselves with the amount of crop we can grow in order to protect the price. And we don't want you, Congress, to get into the subsidy issue on fresh fruits and vegetables. And, you know, it's unfortunate. The impact of that was you didn't grow a lot of these. You could grow more vegetables nationwide than we do. Fruit depends on whether it's stone fruit or whether it's tropical fruits, which obviously we can't grow in this country. And so even our farm program said that if you plant fresh fruits and vegetables on your corn or soybean acres, you lose your subsidy totally on corn and soybeans. So it was a disincentive for people to produce on that land. And so what you ended up with in most of production agriculture is basically large row crop agriculture. And that's changing a bit. In recent farm bills, there have been more direct payments into the fresh fruit and vegetable world. And you're seeing more grown in states that used to grow only the row crops. I want to mention for a moment animal agriculture. Animal agriculture is 60% of the GNP of American agriculture. The majority of American agriculture is animal agriculture in terms of dollars that goes into the pockets of farmers and ranchers. And that's become very industrialized in the last 40 years or so. We grow animals, raise animals in basically big hotels. I don't know if you've ever been to feedlots, but you know, you might have 150,000 cows into an area the size of the Aspen Institute, maybe a little bigger. And some of that was caused by, you know, the nature of the restaurant industry and how we distributed food. Some of it was caused by packaged food, processed food. Some of it was caused by the fact that we used to feed the animals and then we'd ship them to slaughter someplace else, and now we feed them and slaughter them in the same place. And so we grow the crops where they are, and many of the crops are grown in areas where there's a lot of water for irrigation, and those animals are raised in big hotels, and it produces a volume of animal product. And quite honestly, it's compounded by the problem that those animals, if you got 150,000 animals in a room very small, then they get sick very fast. So then they're given hormones, antibiotics, in order to prevent them from getting sick. And that's very controversial, and that practice may be ending in time. But in any event, the fact of the matter is that locally produced food is helpful, but I think we're naive to believe that it's going to feed most people in this country. We're just too big of a country, and too many people don't live anywhere near food-growing areas. And I think we could move our farm programs a bit to be more flexible in this area, and it would allow more fresh fruit and vegetable and alternative agriculture to be grown in other places. Certainly organic agriculture has taken advantage of this niche, but even organic agriculture has become industrialized too. There is this natural tendency in America, entrepreneurial tendency to want to grow. You know, we may not like it, but it's a fact of life. People want to get bigger. They want to produce more. They want to sell more. They want to make more money. It's true in agriculture like it's true in anything else. And so what you got to do is you have to encourage, I think, the things that are positive in terms of direct marketing. Again, the farmers market movement is amazing. In Des Moines, Iowa, there's a farmers market on Saturday. It's 25,000 people. And it's become a big community experience to their lives. It's not only food, but it's other things as well. And, you know, and the farmers markets now everywhere in the country. And so there's great opportunities there. And I mentioned this final thing before, but education. People don't know enough about agriculture and what goes into it, and they don't know about the bad things that are in it either. And one of the nice things about this whole locally growing world is that it does acquaint people personally to the subject of food and what it takes to grow it and what's positive and what's harmful in that process. And I think that is really a positive step. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And next we go to Mardell, and you can actually go off on that a little bit. I mean, within the Children's Health Foundation, the work you do for them, obviously you put a lot of effort in trying to improve the nutrition and the quality of their food. Is trying to source locally part of that? And also, is there an educational aspect as well? I mean, getting kids who are increasingly alienated from farms to understand a little bit more about where that dinner comes from.
I love the fact that I think Dan helped me to segue right into what I think is the most important part of what we're doing with the Children's Health Foundation and looking at education, because that's really bottom line. You want to start with the students. You want to start with elementary students. You want to go through the school system, middle and high school, and really focus on education as a learning tool with gardens. And there are a lot of schools now are starting to establish greenhouses and garden programs in the schools that combine with curriculum in science and health. There are great advantages because right now, if you think about a child being able to plant something, realize that they can help it to grow, and then they can harvest it and eat it, they know and they have a real kind of sense of ownership to it, and then they know that it's healthy. And they start to learn those kinds of habits early on. There's probably less than 2% of the population that's involved with food production today. How many of you in the audience would raise your hand if you've ever raised a garden or been involved with a community garden? Wow, this is the 2%. Here we are. That's great. So community gardens for youth really increase food literacy and leadership capability. There's evidence that gardening benefits children's nutrition and life skills, and involving children in this selection and preparation of their own food. So that's not just something that's being given to them, but they actually start to make choices. They are able then locally to influence their families, some of them actually getting their families to start a garden that maybe they have never done before. There's also a farm-to-school program, which Jennifer is very active with through Cornell, but it's throughout the United States in various regions. And we at the moment have 3 in our area, 3 different regions in Colorado that have farm-to-school programs. And in those, you're able to actually go out to the farm. You can actually have a real experiential kind of experience there, because kids learn better if they're actually actively involved in something that they're doing. So if they're actually there, they see what's happening in growing, they know what's happening with the food that they're taking. And if you think about the difference, she talked a little bit about taste. If you've ever had a homegrown tomato or one in the store, you didn't have to even think about the difference there. So a lot of times children haven't had anything that's homegrown, so they don't know that Brussels sprouts taste great. You buy them from the store, they probably don't. And I think those are the kinds of tastes that is sort of like a light bulb going on for a child to say, wow, this is really pretty great. I've never had this before. So it is educational, and transportation, of course, is another part of that. But one of the ways that we've worked with it locally is with food co-ops, because we're thinking maybe there's a way that we can look at purchasing regulations and approve vendors and get some cooperative purchasing in farm-to-school areas. Now, here in the Western Slope, which is what we call this region, if you go just a few miles further west, is a very rich agricultural area. At one time, this whole valley from Aspen to Glenwood was also a potato-growing area. Well, that's no longer the case because land is too valuable to have potatoes or animals or anything on it. But if you continue on just a bit, we're looking at the region where we will have as much as $1.2 million in potential co-op expenditures, with a percentage of that being saved for the schools. We went to 3 different school districts and looked at whether or not we could take those monies, and instead of putting a lot of it into commodity, could they be going into farm products locally. The distribution and warehousing is an issue, and so the delivering and the ordering is something that we're trying to help farmers and growers in the region to say, how much can you count on the school districts to order? Commodities usually get ordered in February, so we have a pilot program that's going to start this fall we're going to launch a co-op that's going to be for one district that has 10 schools. And if that's successful, then we'll look at the possibility of expanding into 21 schools and going beyond that. I think the main thing with that is that it takes someone like the nonprofit that we have to go out and interview farmers, look at producers, see what they're willing to do, and then know that in this region, because the growing season is very short, they probably need these tunnel greenhouses that can be moved. And we've talked about emphasizing one protein, which will be from a Colorado poultry company, looking at fruits, greens, tomatoes, and potatoes. Those are the things that we can actually grow right here. So we're pretty excited because the benefits of large volume purchasing and cost savings, as well as support of local farmers and local businesses in reducing fuel costs, will be a great advantage to the schools. And we think that will help them with them trying to save money in their budgets. Last year we had, when the economic situation came up and gas was very expensive, people didn't even want to come from the Denver area and make deliveries. The schools were having trouble in this region finding purveyors that would actually deliver product here. So those are things that all of a sudden I think everyone is thinking, what should we be doing if you couldn't get anything transported in? You should be thinking about how you could grow it, how you could learn about it. So we're pretty excited about launching this new effort and see if it can go in more regions in the state as well.
Thanks very much. I am part of that 2%, but I think I've killed more plants than I've actually raised. Yeah. So we go to Bjorn. I want you to ask you, is this worth being concerned about? I mean, should we really, when we're thinking about where our food comes from, when we're thinking about, especially in regards to its impact on climate change, is locality as important as other factors? It's something, or is it still a fairly small niche elite issue?
Yeah, I heard a number of different issues that we were really talking about. We were talking about environment, we're talking about nutrition, we're certainly also talking about community experience and the adventure that it is to grow your garden. And I think we need to look at all of those things. Now, if you look at the environmental impact, it's very clear. You started off mentioning that it has a huge impact, probably more than the transport sector. That's probably true, but let's just remember that's, of course, very little to do with transport. That's all to do about artificial fertilizer, which without it, we wouldn't be able to feed 2 billion people on this planet, and I doubt that we have 2 billion volunteers. And the other part, of course, is it's meat. And again, now we could have a totally different discussion, should we all go to be vegetarians? But I think that's a much, much harder debate to do. And probably that's also why this local thing is so popular, because it seems simple. It seems like something we would want to do. But honestly, let's just take a look at it. We know, and again, I come from Europe, so I don't know the American examples, but a classic example is that people believe tomatoes, for instance, grown in Denmark is better than if it's transported all the way from Spain. But of course, that's wrong, because in Denmark, we actually have to heat our greenhouses, whereas in Spain, they don't. So yes, it's actually better, even just when you look at the CO2 emissions, to buy them from Spain. The problem is there is no way you can ask people to make those decisions in a supermarket. If you have to go and buy stuff and you have to make all kinds of other decisions, do you really want to be standing there and thinking about, what am I forgetting here? Are they heating the greenhouses in Spain, or what is the deal with that? And presumably there's a lot of other issues you also would want to take into account. So my point here is to say, if you care about global warming, and I think we should, you should tax CO2. And then, of course, you will actually have that information implicitly in the price structure, and you shouldn't be concerned about it in that sense. You've already taken it into account as to where you end up buying these issues. Now, when we talk about nutrition, for instance, I worry very much that if we start talking about locally, now it might be, and I think the conclusion of what you told us, and that sounds right to me, is that it probably has the edge. It's not a big thing, but it's probably a little better to buy it locally. But of course, price here must be an incredible issue, and I think that was what Dan pointed out. I mean, at the end of the day, if you can get much cheaper fruits and vegetables and everything else from elsewhere in the world, aren't we going to buy a lot more of that? Doesn't that actually mean that you have a much better and greater opportunity to live healthily if you can buy this cheaply rather than if it has slightly more nutrition, My sense is that I would want to be able to buy fruits and vegetables. We know that's one of the best ways to avoid cancer, that you have that ability to buy a lot of fruits and vegetables all year round at very low cost. And that would probably be the best investment we could do in public health. And then, of course, we also have to remember that this is not just about, well-meaning Westerners saying, oh, it's good to be local. Let's remember that to a very large proportion of the world's inhabitants, agriculture is what they can do. Kenya is one of their biggest exports are flowers now because they do that really well. We don't want to start saying, no, that has to be produced locally. We don't want to shut off the world. I mean, actually, we know very well how we make a world where you only buy locally. That's sort of a medieval world in a sense. That's the world in which we don't just not have a reduction in trade barriers, but perhaps even put up trade barriers within our own countries. I would hate to see that kind of situation, both because it makes everyone poor, but also because it makes the third world poor. So I worry about this both on the nutrition side and the environment side, whether this is really the right way. And it seems to me that there's a good chance that it's actually the wrong way, both if you want to deal with nutrition and if you want to deal with environment. Let me just briefly return to the last point, the community argument, which I actually think can be strong. But again, I think that's also how I'm cast. So I'm going to go in there full speed and just be the annoying guy, and ask, do you know about most stuff in your life? No. The truth of the matter is the reason why we're rich, the reason why this world works so well is because I don't know most things that happen around me. That's specialization. That's what happened over the last 500 years. I actually didn't raise my hand with gardening. Occasionally I go there and I enjoy it, but I'm incredibly happy somebody else is farming for me and that I just get the food. And I'm incredibly happy somebody organizes my flights, so I just go here. I'm incredibly happy that there are other people doing virtually everything so that I can be good at something very, very specific, or hope to be good at something very specific, and just let somebody else deal with virtually everything else. Now, if you want to go in a garden, hey, let's have that opportunity, because I think it's something that really gives great life quality to some people. But let's not hope that most people would want to do this. Exactly, we want to move most of the problems, most of all the different burdens, be it flying, making airplanes fly to Aspen, which I think everybody realized was hard yesterday, and growing our foods. Let's have somebody else do that. So I would be very worried about having this as a grand goal. It's good if we just see it as an opportunity. So if we look at the three things, environment, no, I think we can do a lot better and do it much smarter. For nutrition, I think we can actually do a lot better if we have a global and open market, also for the third world. And the knowledge community thing, I think that very much has to be a voluntary issue if we're actually going to do good stuff.
Thanks very much. I'm going to ask just a few questions and we'll open up very quickly to the audience. Jennifer, you do the farm school program, and we can, that last part, the community aspect of this, when in doing that, what is the value? I mean, what do kids, what do they get out of it to know more? I mean, Bjorn's basically saying he's happy not knowing much about the food system. That's the nature of the global economy, I think. Or not having to worry about it, I guess would be a better term. What's the value to knowing about it, to actually being familiar with this?
Well, let me just talk about first the food that is brought in a farm-to-school program. I mean, most farm-to-school programs focus on fruits and vegetables. The quality seems to be different enough, better enough, that the children actually respond to it. And not only do the children respond to it, but we're seeing spillover effects in the cafeteria staff themselves, where the diets of the lunch ladies, the workers in the cafeteria, actually become better. They start buying off the truck of the farmer as well. And they're wasting less of the product because there's less shrinkage. They don't have to trim as much. They have much more usable product, so they're wasting less. The children seem to respond to that quality. They also respond to seeing the people in the cafeteria staff really enjoying the product. I mean, it's kind of this whole win-win when you have high-quality product coming in, the staff feel I guess, honored in some way that they are using and being able to prepare with really wonderful product. That is projected into the students, and they respond to it as well. You get kids in I know that you mentioned gardening. You get kids into a garden, and they see how food grows. They actually can be involved in growing some food. It really, you can see them transform in terms of their willingness to try something. You get them involved in a garden, whether it's kale, carrots, whatever it is, they're going to want to eat it. Much more likely than if you just try to serve it in the cafeteria. So I think that exposure, having them know more about the story of food, even though, yes, I can agree that sometimes it's better not to have to be worried about all the details, but kids really respond to knowing the story of something, and they're much more willing to try it when they know maybe the people that are involved in growing it. They know what's involved in growing it. They see it. It's exciting to see things grow out of the ground, especially if it's not eaten by bugs first or so forth. Anyway.
So I'm going to ask one question to Dan before I open it up. As you pointed out, our system we produce an amazing amount of calories, just raw calories, at a very low cost. Is that ultimately, though, sustainable? Which is, say, both environmentally, because this is a very chemicalized system, and also, is it healthy? I mean, you were on the childhood obesity panel. To some degree, we are producing an awful lot of calories that are not the healthiest calories. And if that's the case, can any shift towards local food, a more varied system, help deal with that?
Well, I think the public is speaking in a variety of ways. I mean, they're saying that they want less pesticides, less herbicides, less hormones in their food, and therefore modern agriculture has to respond. The markets will work to get them to respond. The problem is that it's one foot on the brake and one foot on the accelerator, because they want the food available at all times, all places, now, and at reasonable prices. And that is a fundamental fact of food and agriculture. No matter, now there may be some very wealthy people that don't have to go that way, but to an average person working hard, making $75,000 a year, this part of their life is not probably going to change. So, but I do think that, I guess my answer would be two things. Number one is that we need an effective regulatory system in this country that is arm's length from industry, that makes good scientific decisions, and in fact protects the health of the American people from outside forces they can't protect themselves from. And that's why I've been, in the years I've left the Department of Agriculture, more and more concerned about the ingredients used in animal agriculture, because I don't think that they necessarily are healthy for, all of them are healthy for people. But at the same time, the rule of reason has to apply here. And the rule of reason is some locally grown stuff is good for a lot of the reasons we talked about there, but I doubt it's going to fundamentally change the agriculture of this country or the world.
Open up to the audience. You were first.
I do think it's an elite question and a niche. I do also know that every place I go, the first thing I do is go to maps and find out where the farmer's market is. And I do know that in my life, I've taken on and want to continue to take on more responsibility for whether it's my finances, my medicines, my health care, and now my food. Because I used to trust the supermarket. And about 10 years ago, I lost that trust. And so, I don't know. I mean, I'm here thinking absolutely globally and for the masses. I don't see that we can make huge steps away from agriculture, agriculture. But golly, I want everyone in my circle, everyone I know, to know about farmers markets, because it's every day, every meal, I mean, it's huge at that personal, private level.
Jennifer, do you want?
So,
Can I respond? There wasn't really a question in there, but I just had a few thoughts. One of which is that when we look at what you were saying, Dan, about consumer expectations of wanting the same variety of fruits and vegetables standardized every day of the year, that's a relatively recent expectation if you look back in history. And we've gotten to a point where we do not produce the variety in localities that we used to. We've become much more centralized, much more specialized in our agriculture, and for example, Iowa is a great example, and people say, well, we can't grow fruits and vegetables in Iowa. Well, that's just not true. You can have much more diversity in how we're using our agricultural lands, and what about our agricultural policies could actually help diversify our agriculture.
I agree with that.
So
by the
that,
way.
good.
I told you the farm policies prevent people from growing fresh fruits and vegetables on program cropped land, or they lose their subsidies.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. And when we look at what makes sense, we should be asking, well, what makes sense to grow locally? And fruits and vegetables are the food groups that we continue to be most interested in terms of their health benefits. You mentioned relationship to heart disease and cancer. So wouldn't it make sense for communities, localities, states to look at their agricultural lands and ask, well, what can we do here in terms of being at least somewhat self-reliant in those very high value, expensive to transport crops, specialty crops? Why do we call them specialty crops? Why do we call them specialty crops?
Because they're not
because
program
they're not
crop
commodities. They're paid for through the commodity program. Okay. So another thing I just wanted to throw out there is this idea of seasonality. Why is it normal? Why is it an expectation that we have fresh strawberries in January? When did that become normal, that we have fresh tomatoes all year round? Most of the year they're substandard in quality. The dietary guidelines, which I think you mentioned in either this panel or the last one, are renegotiated, reevaluated every 5 years, and on not so frequent a basis we come up with a new dietary guidance image and that implementation strategy. So why can't we include in our dietary guidance ideas about seasonality and what foods should be consumed in different seasons for not only health but also for supporting local agriculture?
Well, I was just thinking, because what I drew out of what you said was essentially, again, the idea of prioritization, that you can't do it all. I mean, you want to take charge of your health, you want to take charge of what you eat, you want to take charge of all these areas, but if you spend more time with one of these areas, that's time you can't spend on some of these others. And so there is a trade-off in that sense in saying, well, how much are you going to not trust the supermarkets versus how much, I don't know what that is, but how much are you not going to take charge of your own healthcare? And I think that's the exact same sort of issue that we have in a public setting where you have to make this judgment of saying, well, how much money and concern are you going to be spending on this? One of the things I think is crucial, we have had that debate a lot in Denmark, should you give everybody in schools ecological foods? Now, that sounds nice, but let's just remember it costs more. That means that's money you can't spend on other things that you presumably also want, like better teachers, or more school material, or better schools, or more, all the kinds of stuff that we need to have a conversation about. So, should we spend more money on buying local foods, and where should that money be taken from, or what should we not be prioritizing higher? That's the priority that I want us to think about. So it's not that this is not good. Virtually everything most people talk about is good in some sense, but it's how much better is it compared to all the other things we could do.
I just had a question about, and I've heard different points of view on this, where looking at the carbon footprint of mechanized versus local, massive mechanization, and that actually local has a larger carbon footprint because there's less efficiencies in the way that the produce is transported and in the way that it's treated and all this stuff, and that a lot of times local, when people say local, it actually, the radius can be quite large, and there's no real definition on what local means. Is it 10 miles? Is it 200? Like, how far are these people coming from? And so I just wanted to get kind of your view on that. I don't know, what's the truth of the matter there?
One thing, if it's local or organic, these are terms that have definitions that seem to be very much in flux.
Right, I'm talking about just local, not
right.
I get it. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
There's organic peaches and local non-organic, and they might come from the same farm even.
Yeah, so I think what you're bringing up is that when you look at the carbon footprint of a product, there are a lot of factors involved in that number. Yeah. And there's a supermarket in England, Tesco, I think, that are now, they started this program where they're going to put the carbon footprint, the number of grams of carbon on the labels of, they want to do it for all their products.
It turned out to be incredibly hard.
And they started with crisps, potato chips, which, basically has one ingredient plus some herbs and so forth. And that was hard enough. So, but when you look at, eating locally, is it the answer, is the title of this panel. If the question or the issue is lowering carbon footprint, then there are so many things to consider. What kind of car you're driving to the farmer's market, how many times you drive to the supermarket, what kind of energy and how much energy you use when you cook. Transportation is one of those issues, and also growing method, whether it is a carbon-based fertilizer or pesticides. All of those things matter. And how much you eat. The other thing is, the food supply produces 300 extra calories per person, or food supply disappearance date is 300 extra calories. If we cut down on the total amount we eat, maybe that would translate into lower production, which is also going to lower the carbon footprint. Eating less meat definitely lowers the carbon footprint, especially the way most of our meat is produced, as Dan suggested.
I mean, I had a chance last week to go to Marin County outside San Francisco and visit Bill Nyman, who's Nyman Ranches, a formerly of Nyman Ranches, who's one of the original guys when it comes to sustainable meat production. I would ask him, well, it still has a fairly large footprint. His plan was simply, well, you have to eat less meat, which is a very unique marketing principle for a guy who raises meat. But and also eat less. And frankly, again, to go back to the obesity question, I mean, is it necessarily healthy that our food system is producing so much food? I mean, maybe it's too hard on an industrial level to think about that, but it's worth considering. Good.
Yeah, my name is Ken Kaplan. From MIT, work with collaborative initiatives at MIT working. We just finished a year-and-a-half study on looking at childhood obesity in the food system, working with a group at Columbia Institute, Mr. Conner. One of the things that came out around the child obesity issue was the lack of available nutritious food, low-calorie food in certain parts of the country. It's described as food deserts.
Right.
Actually, a lot of these food deserts are in urban areas, suburban areas, but predominantly some of them are in the agricultural supporting counties of the country where you have a problem of there is no choice.
Mm-hmm.
You go into these parts of the country and there's just literally Mississippi's on them, where farming is actually a tradition, but you have to drive 150 miles, 200 miles to get a food plant. All the foods that are available are these industrial processed foods, which the evidence is pretty clear have very low, not only nutritional value, but are underpinnings of a lot of the chronic illnesses in this country. In fact, if you look at those same counties, parts of the country, you'll see 4 or 5 of the biggest epidemics in not only child obesity, but diabetes, chronic heart illness, and cancer. So, and we've been talking to a lot of the industry players, and what's interesting is I'm seeing as a trend on the industry side wanting to change this system, because I think the failure right now, the global, the national system, is they're not getting to these parts of these regions. And I would say it's not just the United States. I suspect this is going to be a growing problem around the world where there is this very the distribution system is not equitable, and I think it's driven by a lot of complex factors, which are it's not a simple solution. But I just wanted to point that out, that I think that the current global national system, I think, is actually, when I talk to some of the leaders in the industry, are acknowledging that their system is not getting to these parts of the world. And again, it's a cost matter, it's an efficiency matter. They're making money on these low-cost products, and that's been the history of the agriculture. My expertise is not in agriculture. I actually come out of an architecture, health background. But I've been looking at the food system for the last year and a half with the group at Columbia. I'm really struck at how the system has shifted. And I shifted over from trends and to the point where whole segments of the population are out of reach of some of these foods. So I think the local gets, in my mind, significant in terms of regional, building up regional systems, which were at one time robust, and really integrating them with the national global. And I think that's a trend that
So could I just, because I don't know enough about this, but why is there not fruits and vegetables and a supermarket in Mississippi? I mean, surely that's...
There's certain parts of the country where there's just no large-scale supermarkets. Part of it is just divine power in those parts of the country. It's not there. You go into, for instance, Harlem didn't have a supermarket until 10 years ago. Pathmark took a number of years to get in there. The size of the footprint of the supermarket, this is the architect's wing, has to be a certain scale, which a lot of cities will not allow the zoning for. So it actually gets down to a very political, local issue. That's changing a little bit. And also this myth that these supermarkets couldn't be profitable.
But sorry, the solution here seems to be about income, and it seems to be about perhaps availability, but certainly not just saying, well, you can only buy locally in Mississippi, right? That wouldn't solve the problem. That seems
No,
to me.
but it would certainly enhance it if there's certain parts of the country which are farming regions and have a tradition. I mean, the Iowa one's great. When we were out in Iowa, I was shocked to realize at one point Iowa was this incredibly complex, multi-faceted system producing all kinds of everything except citrus fruit, right? I mean, and what happened? Why did that and the soil quality was a lot to do with it. Why did that whole system shift away? Why did the country go from that system to a three-crop system? I agree with the subsidies, but you have to look at the subsidy side. I'm not defending it, but there's a lot of reasons. I mean, Dan would know better.
You came up with hybrid corn, which changed the face of agriculture in America. It's too complicated to talk about here.
Right. But the efficiency, you go back to the origins of the efficiency issue. I think you have to give credit to the industry early on for developing efficiencies which were extraordinary, producing an enormous amount of food, high calorie, albeit, at the expense of some of these nutritional values, I think. And I think that's, again, and also neglecting certain parts of production in the system. But I think the transportation issue was huge. I think it's not well understood. We've been talking to the head of Cisco about this issue. And I think, in our mind, the solution will be, I think, bringing together industry and government at this point in time. Because I think the underpinning issue here is in childhood obesity is this early stage chronic illness that is right now, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the health side of the equation, the predominance of the budget in the next 20, 30 years is going to be paying for these illnesses that are emerging in kids at the age of 5 years old. I mean, this is historic. We're seeing for the first time a generation that's going to have a shorter lifespan in this country. And it's not, again, I'm not trying to point any fingers, it's just the fact that how the system is done already.
Just to mention one of the mechanisms where localities and sometimes at the state level, people are coming together to address some of those issues. I mean, when you look at municipalities, we have the water department, we have various departments. We don't have departments of food.
Right.
And it would really be good, I think, to have those not only at maybe county levels, municipalities, but at state level. And there are now what's called food policy councils that are either at the state level, they can be at county level, or like Toronto, the city of Toronto has a very active food policy council. And this is where they can be either politically appointed or they're a body that's within the government, usually, of the state that looks at the issues of food for that political boundary, that political entity. So they're asking, how food secure are we? There are a number of studies that are looking now at, could New York feed itself? Could, BC, Canada feed itself, or what proportion? So that the issue of not solely feeding a nation or not being isolationist about it, but what makes sense in terms of how self-reliant in food should we be? What makes sense politically? What makes sense environmentally? What makes sense in terms of health? So that kind of body, a food policy council, is one mechanism for asking these questions and looking at solutions.
Sure. But why would New York want to feed itself? I don't understand this idea. I mean, wouldn't we want to grow? I mean, yes, I see that there are some problems, and I'm learning something about Mississippi, but it seems to me that the wrong decision would be to say, all right, so we got to make a food council that start talking about how we should do these things. I mean, there's also a good chance that these food councils would come up with politically expedient things like you want to eat, ecological and you want to eat locally and all this stuff, which makes great sense for people who have a lot of money, but perhaps not for people who don't. Don't we want to make sure that we grow it where it's the most efficient? That is also actually, and I think that feeds into your question. That's one of the points that actually make it environmentally more sound, because you can do it incredibly efficiently, that is with less fertilizer leakage and with less CO2.
Yeah, definitely there are places that have a better propensity, the soils, the climate, for growing particular crops. But we've gone completely, I think, too far in that direction, where there are many places, Iowa, again, is a good example, where there used to be much more diversity, and that the soils and the climate are suitable for growing much more diversity than we currently have. So the tendency has been to increase reliance on distant sources for foods that are critical for health. And the question is, well, where's the logical balance? Or maybe not even logical, but where is the balance that makes the most sense on a number of criteria deemed most important by the people who live there?
Let me take one more. Right.
Coming from New York, I can tell you that local is questionable sometimes. During the winter, for instance, our local area spreads tremendously because obviously we can't get a lot of stuff in the wintertime. But one of the things that we do that's crazy, and I ask you this, maybe it's a quick question, is that oftentimes in our supermarkets we get apples from Washington State when we should be getting it from New York State. I mean, New York State is known as the Big Apple. And we don't even use the local stuff that we get. So if you talk about the carbon footprint, and you talk about local, that's a perfect example of how we're not using local well. I'm not sure what kind of policies you can put into place to make sure that if you've got the local, that you use the local when you can, support your own farms. But
Well, one of the policies that was changed with the last Farm Bill was to allow schools to do local procurement. That's one thing that's happening. Yes, and New York, because of New York City, currently cannot feed itself, and that's just not going to happen. But in terms of the winter, we can do a lot more than we're currently doing. There are many crops, apples being a great example, that store extremely well throughout the winter time, including up until nearly the point at which the next crop is coming in. But what it means for consumers is to not have an expectation that you have certain fresh fruits and vegetables in your diet all year long. Seasonality used to be commonplace, and now, in season on a menu maybe doesn't mean that much anymore because it's in season somewhere on the planet, and it can get to that restaurant.
I do have to wonder how realistic that is, though, ultimately, because as you point out, the elimination virtually of seasonality is a fairly recent phenomena, but so are many other things that we don't really want to necessarily give up. But is there data on, because clearly if you were to adopt to a fairly local seasonal diet, you have to change what you're eating.
Right.
Is there much information on how that may compare nutritionally to what if you were able to take everything?
I actually did a study of comparing diets, menus that were designed for fall, winter, and spring. Summer I didn't bother with because that's a no-brainer. And compared those menus. They were 7-day menus for those 4 seasons based on what's available in New York or potentially from New York State agriculture. And all of the diets were more than adequate from a nutritional standpoint.
But were they better or worse? I mean, on balance, they were probably a little worse, right?
What do you mean worse?
Well, in the sense that you, in your first presentation, you said on balance, local foods probably are more nutritious. But if you look on balance on a diet that's put together by buying in a supermarket in New York where you buy everything, don't question the seasonality, and look at a budget constraint versus this way where you only look at what's seasonal and where you can buy it locally, what would be the nutritionality?
Okay, so not getting into all the specifics of the study, but what can change over the seasons is not only what you eat, but the form in which you eat it. So you may still eat tomatoes in February, but they're going to be from some canned form or dry, right? So you can have a lot of the same foods, but they're just going to be in a different form. Then you will also have more root crops that are fresh stored than you might have at other times of the year. So in terms of, I'm not quite sure.
But surely there must be less C vitamin, just like you pointed out.
Oh, no, not at all.
In a canned
Potatoes are a very good source of
in a
vitamin
canned
C.
tomato than in a fresh tomato?
A lot of times the nutrient retention can be greater in a processed product because you don't have, for example, if it's harvested at its peak ripeness and stored, yep.
More nutrient in processed tomatoes, I'm sorry. Because
Pardon me?
More nutrients in processed tomatoes.
Yeah, exactly.
Lycopene is lipid soluble, and there's really no comparison between fresh tomatoes and sauces and processed tomatoes. So that example, go back to apples. I'm from Washington State.
I'm from Washington State and I live in New York.
I want to do a back of the envelope calculation for you very quickly. You truck in the winter 1 ton of fresh lettuce into New York City. The calorie value for that in human calories that we consume is going to be 100,000 calories, enough for about 50 people for 1 day. You truck in 1 ton of potato chips into New York City, that is going to be 6 million calories, enough for 3,000 people. So economically, what makes more sense? And probably the chips are probably going to be cheaper anyway, certain per calorie.
Right.
And the cost of transport is going to be the same. So economically, what makes sense?
But of course, what about the external
I'm
costs?
saying it's good. I'm saying it's the reality.
What about the health external costs of a diet that would be increasingly composed mostly?
And the fuel
potato chips?
use.
There are the externalities, yes.
Okay.
But, you're having an economic discussion here. Let's talk about those as well.
Let me ask the guy all the way in the back who's been very patient.
Well, the question, Bjorn is raising this thing about cost of food and those who can afford a more exclusive diet and more elitist diet, I think you're saying. We have an obesity problem. That means people are eating too much food. Is food too cheap?
Not for everybody.
I understand that, but is food too cheap?
Well, first of all, you're presuming that the reason for the obesity is entirely related to food, and I think a big chunk of it, but I'd say as big a chunk of it is related to mobility and lack thereof, which we have revolutionary change in the last 50 years.
Well, obesity is calories in. You can exercise in this town here is an exercise fanatic town, but not everybody is rail thin here. If you look at the statistics of how much calories you burn from exercise, I don't disagree with you that walking a couple miles a day is good for you, but that's not what causes obesity. It's calories in. Every study in the world shows that it's calories in. And I'm not saying food is too cheap. I'm asking, this question is sort of paramount to a lot of what's being said here, is, and when I say too cheap, is beef too cheap because our system is skewed in a fashion that pays for cheap beef but doesn't pay for cheap fresh picked lettuce?
I think that our farm programs have been deliberately designed to help farmers stay on the land through direct subsidies, and those subsidies have not been integrated into the cost of food. That is, we have shielded the consumer from the subsidy. So let's you take corn, for example, although in last year or two, corn has inched up in price, and now corn prices are probably at more what you call replacement value levels than they were maybe 5 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that the animal that feeds on that corn is getting a subsidized price, and that affects the price of the meat that's there. We have done that as a national policy for 2 reasons. We have said since the Great Depression we want to keep farmers on the land, and it was largely the row crop farmers that were failing in the 30s. Okay, and so we dust bowl, row crop, everything else. So we wanted to keep them on the land, and we didn't want to do the European system, where largely the food prices the subsidies were implemented into the food price themselves. Food prices in Europe overall are 30 to 50% higher than they are in the United States. Why is that? Well, there are a lot of reasons why, but the main reason has to do with the fact that we protect the consumer from the price in this country. They don't. Now, maybe that means they eat better. I don't know what the implemented fact of that is. But this goes to a very important question, is what should our farm policy be? And how does the consumer pay for that in this process? And again, for the last 70 years, we've been protecting consumers from higher prices. And Americans overall pay the lowest per capita amount for food of any country in the world. And that's just a deliberate decision that's been made.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think some of our food is too cheap, and some of it is too expensive, and that's the problem, and that's where it seems like the farm policy has really gotten us messed up. And now we were talking last night about now going back and taxing soda pop or junk food or all the things that can only be so cheap because of our farm policy that makes those commodities, and so it seems like it's kind of a backward system. As a family doc, I take care of folks who will tell me they can't buy a pepper in the store because they can buy 2 Big Macs for the size, cost of a green pepper. Yeah. The only reason they can do that is because corn is so cheap and wheat is so cheap, and all of that means we just, some food is too cheap, for food, I guess.
Well, the basic row crop commodities are cheap, is I think.
But then that's also
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I definitely agree to the extent that we've subsidized some things, and that's actually turned too cheap. Clearly, in Europe, we've subsidized dramatically sugar, which essentially means that people probably consume too much of it. And yes, then it's an awkward situation that you then tax it afterwards and end up with more inefficiencies. But let me just, so I definitely think we should start having a conversation.
By the way, if I just interrupt you for a minute. In the United States, we don't subsidize the price of sugar. The sugar is supported the same way that dairy is in Europe. It is the sugar, because of sugar quotas, you pay 3 times the price of sugar that they pay in the Caribbean for sugar here. However, because of that, high fructose corn syrup has taken on a much greater role than it did before, because sugar was overpriced, so corn is probably underpriced.
Yeah.
Right,
but if I so I absolutely agree that we should try to get this straight, though I doubt that this is the forum where we're going to settle the agricultural subsidies, because there's another political issue that you didn't talk about, that there's a lot of political votes from farm country, which probably is also part of it. But let me just mention something else, though. I mean, don't we all like to eat? I mean, I like to eat fatty, bad foods. And to a certain extent, we very often, when we're all sitting together and everybody's being very healthy, we're all like, yeah, people ought not to eat that, and they're going to die sooner and stuff like that. But it seems to me that at least we should have a conversation. I'm just throwing it out there. To what extent it's okay that we eat a lot, and yes, then we die sooner. But it might be a happier life.
Take one last question back.
It is so upsetting to me that 2 McDonald's Big Macs are cheaper than a pepper. And I think the only reason that is the case is that we are not honestly accounting for the externalities. If we factored in the deforestation of the rainforest, the methane gas that comes from the cow, the
is that? But
So who's going to make that decision? Is the government going to decide how much the environmental degradation is, and they're going to put a specific dollar amount on that, or is the private sector going to make that decision? Well, no, but that's a deliberate. That was a deliberate decision, and that wasn't with respect to the price of the food. That was just to the amount that it was going to go to the farmer in that circumstance.
You know, structurally change the system. So we could do the reverse.
We could deliberately
You could, I
decide
guess.
to do something
You could.
else.
I mean,
In the 70s, the system we have now of subsidies, and that's also where you start to see obesity. By the time it really hit
No, the 30s.
well, the only way to do that is what Bjorn had said, is that to put a carbon tax on would be certainly part of that type of thing, you know. I worry about a group of brilliant people sitting in the halls of some government office building making these decitions.
it should be us.
Because I'm not saying farm,
These weren't brilliant.
and by the way, that's no excuse for repeating that precedent either.
I'm afraid we've hit the end of our time, but I'm sure there's just another half hour. People will stick around and talk. We got a little bit off topic, which I thought was great, actually. You know, why stay local when you can just go around and talk about whatever you want? Thanks very much.